So you finished your first draft, but now what? Well, no first draft is perfect, which means it's time to move on to your first of many rounds of editing. With your first draft, it'll be important not to get caught up in the nitty-gritty grammar and style choices, but rather focus on the more big picture things like structure, plot, and characters. There's no point in polishing a stone if you're just going to throw it back into the quarry. Or there's no point in polishing a scene if the scene itself may get cut or drastically changed. Hi, hello, welcome in. I'm Jerica, and I'm an editor, writer, and all-around content creator. And I'm here to talk about your first round of self-editing and give you a little guidance on where to begin. So, where do you start? Well, first things first, let it rest. You'll hear differing advice on how long you should actually wait before returning to your manuscript to edit, anywhere from 3 days, 3 weeks, all the way up to like 3 months. But it's hard to give specific advice because it's a little personal based on your brain, process, patience, project, deadlines, and probably a bunch of other things. To figure out how long you should step away from your project, we should really just talk about why you're stepping away. With our own writing, we tend to suffer from the forest for the trees problem. We're familiar with both our story and the words that we've written, so whether this is your first draft and you're looking at big picture ideas, or it's your 10th and you're polishing grammar, your brain might be filling in some holes without you even realizing it. So your goal in stepping away is to come back with the freshest eyes you possibly can. Obviously, you can't come back with perfectly fresh eyes because it is your work, but there are some tips and tricks on how to come back with fresh eyes. Particularly for your first draft, I think rest, just some time away from it is the biggest one. I have some tips and tricks for later editing, so if you're interested in that as well, definitely remember to subscribe and hit the bell. It's easier to come back to your manuscript after this time with a more editor and reader perspective. Consider going back to your piece once you've kind of forgotten about what you've written, once you've stopped obsessing. Now, I doubt all of us can step away and never think about the project. You're going to have ideas, and you can absolutely take notes about things that you might change or explore, but don't go back to the manuscript yet. While you're taking this time away, get to know what your goals are with this round of edits. Just like when you go to hire an editor, you're going to want to have strict goals in mind when you do self-editing as well. Since we're looking at your first draft, you're going to want to avoid changing small things because it's quite possible at this stage of editing that you're going to revamp or entirely trash scenes. So making those small changes is kind of a waste of your time. Early draft editing should focus on elements like structure, plot, and characters. Ask yourself questions like, is it clear what this character desires? Is first-person point of view the best point of view for this story? Is this the correct order of events? Have I given enough clues that the reader won't feel betrayed by this twist? Or rather, have I given too many clues that the twist is too obvious? Am I starting in the most interesting place that I can? Later drafts can and should look at more specific structure and style, like passive versus active voice and overused or filler words, while your final draft will focus on grammar and spelling, to make sure nothing has fallen through the cracks before you start submitting or self-publishing. With those questions in mind, read first, edit later. I know it can be difficult to keep that red pen at bay when you're first starting out, but especially when you're working through a more substantive or big picture edit, it's important to get a handle on things with a much wider lens. Because we're not going line by line for edits, it doesn't make sense to read line by line. You may be able to get away going chapter by chapter if you're working on a novel, but in most cases for this first round of edits, I would still advise to read the whole thing. This, of course, doesn't mean you can't take notes. Please take notes as you read through, but keep them brief and really focus on keeping your attention on the story and those big picture elements. Yes, you know the story, but it doesn't mean you wrote it that way. Sometimes things can morph in our memories, and it's possible that there's been quite a bit of time from when you first sat down to write this manuscript. To help with your focus during this reading process, I highly recommend using some sort of revising document like a reverse outline. Not sure what that is? Lucky for you, I have a blog post out and a video coming soon. What I'm really getting at is our memories are fickle. So give your full piece, or at the very least a large section, a read through before diving into edits. Big picture edits really do require you to have a big picture to work on. And now that you're ready to actually dive into edits, don't just revise, rewrite. It is definitely more work, but in my opinion, it can be such a helpful process. It's actually something that I've been doing since the dawn of time, maybe one of the only things that I was doing right before I had ever looked at any sort of writing advice. Because when I was younger, I wrote everything out by hand first, I was then forced to type it up. Now, I don't always do this now. I tend to outline by hand and then write with my keyboard, especially since I was in school, because I didn't always know if I'd have the time to write it out by hand first. But I always tried to take the opportunity to rewrite if I could. There are a few things that this does for me, and hopefully will do for you. The first is that it allows my brain to think about saying the sentence a different way. Yes, you can obviously edit sentences on the page, but there's something about reading the idea and then rewriting the sentence. Sometimes you just have this inkling that it should be written slightly differently, and you can always revert back if it ends up not working. Your brain is always working in the background, so stop and listen. The other thing it does is gives a blank slate. Now, often we're a little bit scared of the blank slate, but I think in this case, because we already have done the work, the blank slate gives us freedom to play around a little bit. I find we can struggle to change our precious, but there's far less harm in recreating it. We can allow it to change and morph without fearing the loss of the original copy. Yes, of course, in the digital age, we can, make a copy and work on the copy instead, but it kind of defeats the purpose of this technique. While I think this is a great technique for everyone to use, it may just be bias, but try it out, even if it's just for a chapter, and see if it really does change how you're writing. And now we'll sum up these 4 points a little bit so that you can see how they flow into one another. At this point in editing, you should be focusing on big changes. You should avoid getting bogged down in the minutia of grammar, and that's another reason why rewriting instead of revising is so good, because you kind of get around this rule. While you let your piece rest, consider what parts of your story you want to focus on. Create a list of questions in line with those that I spoke about before, but try to make them more specific to your manuscript. So instead of, is it clear what the character desires? Try, is it clear that Jenny wants a promotion? Read your manuscript before putting pen to paper or finger to backspace to get a clear picture of your current story. Yes, you think you know everything about your story, but our memories are more fickle than you think. And you've likely learned and changed a lot since those first words. Start rewriting, not just revising. Let your brain work in the background while you make your big changes, because it will likely fix some of the smaller things without you having to focus on it. Play with your words on the blank canvas. The old draft will still be there if you need it. And now you start all over again with even more edits. With each pass, try focusing on something different. Of course, I will be back with some more tips and tricks on editing your later drafts, but that doesn't mean that you can't press on without me. Look at your dialogue, pay attention to the stakes, Ask if there's enough interiority. Ask yourself if your sentences vary enough, both in structure and length. Do you rely too heavily on adverbs where a stronger verb would do the trick? And are all those commas really necessary? Or maybe you don't see any commas, and that can also be a problem. Sooner than you think, you'll be on to your final polish and maybe even considering hiring a copy editor, though you can always work with a pro before this, or forgo pros altogether before sending your manuscript off to agents or beginning your self-publishing journey. I hope I've given you a good starting point to tackle your first round of edits. Don't be afraid to ask questions in the comments, and keep me in mind for substantive editing of short stories, as well as copy editing for both short and long pieces. I hope this was helpful and you enjoyed. I had a blast. Catch you next time. Bye! Ow. Hey! Changes that you made your notes that you will notice. Pro for that final polish. Final polish.